Alors, bienvenue à tous et à toutes dans cette deuxième partie de cette journée.
So welcome to the second half of this study day. I'm delighted to be there to introduce the second session of this very interesting day. I'd like to thank the organizers, the interpreters who are enabling us to follow the seminar in both languages.
Vous pouvez choisir des... Attendez que j'ai mis entre-temps la langue au-dessous. Vous pouvez choisir entre...
So, you can choose between the French and the English channel. But before introducing the next speaker, I'd like to mention that today follows on from the footsteps of various other stages which were recalled by Vincent, which show the growing interest towards this theme, the theme of piracy and seafaring, as a theme for study as well as a field of historical and anthropological research in the broadest sense of the term. This theme has opened up the discussion in social sciences. There are researchers today who are interested in the anthropological and historical aspect of rebellious dissident experiences that happened at sea. And just as a reminder, when Graeber's book was published in Italian, Vincent Guignot and Maurizio Esposito made a presentation at the Sapienza in Rome, which opened the way for a cycle of seminars during a year that was entirely dedicated to maritime radicalism, which shows that there's a growing interest of the social sciences towards this theme. It's also worth recalling that there is a group which was formed about 2 years ago, Hermeneutica, made up of young researchers, students, activists, and professors who like to talk about the sea and the experience of the sea, and through this, various forms of activism. So this is just part of this story. It hasn't been published yet, but it contains some of the issues that were raised in the debate and that are probably going to be raised in the interventions of the next speakers. So I'd really like some of the members of this group to take part in the debate at the end of the presentations. Now I'd like to introduce the three speakers for today's session, or the second session. Mathilde Heslon is the first speaker. She's a doctoral student at the Museum of Quai Branly. She's working on a project whose title is Affliction of Young People in Mayotte, Sorcery and Medical Social Institutions. She will talk about Comoros as a port where pirates stopped in the Caribbean, a stopover port. Then Raphaël Thibault is a postdoctoral student at the Museum of Quai Branly. He's working on a project on European firearms in Madagascar, the import and circulation of firearms in the 17th and 18th century. He will talk about Zana, Malata and slaves, the legacy of pirates in Madagascar between 1720 and 1750. Next will be David Chonu, who's studied at the Museum of Quai Branly and currently at the University of Bretagne Occidentale, Western Brittany, and Sorbonne University. He will present Lines of Friendship, the Pirate Utopia, International Law to do with initial modernity, 16th century, beginning of the 17th century. And then we will end with the conclusions of Marcus Rediker, who is a history professor at the University of Pittsburgh. I don't think he needs any introduction. His work was already mentioned by Vincent during the introduction. Now let's just recall that he has written several books on the experiences of pirates and forms of radicalism at sea. He has inspired an entire generation of researchers who are working on these themes. After these 4 speeches, there will be a round table between 5:30 and 6:30, so you can ask questions on the YouTube channel in French and in English, even in Italian if you want. We can translate it ourselves. And I'd now like to give the floor to the first speaker.
Alors bonjour à tous, je vais vous partager l'écran.
Good afternoon. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the PowerPoint that I'm using.
Et voilà.
Here you have it. So I suggest that we should take stock on the various aspects linked to piracy in the Comoros, whilst integrating them into the wider sphere of piracy in the Indian Ocean. Now, this is not the theme of my research per se, but a number of books and historical sources make reference to it. And so on the back cover of the book Comoros, 4 Islands Between Pirates and Plantation Owners, there's a description of these islands in the Indian Ocean as a haven for filibusters hunted out from the Caribbean. But all it takes is a few pages, all it takes is to look in a little more detail at the 2 volumes by Jean Martin to see that it only focuses on this issue from 5 out of 800 pages. And as Jean Martin himself stated, his data was drawn essentially from the collection of ancient works, Grandidier, who also harks back to the texts translated by the infamous Charles Johnson on the pirate. However, the identity of Charles Johnson remains a mystery because no captain was recorded at that time in Great Britain. John Robert Moore attributes the pseudonym to Daniel Defoe, according to a stylistic analysis, but this is sometimes contested. Furthermore, Charles Johnson's book, A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, published in 1724, is not only fictionalized. He also turned to other archives and texts that are found in Grandidier or that are referred to by Deschamps or Gevrey, and you can thereby look at what is the interrelational mechanisms or trade and political power play that linked and brought together pirates and local populations. Despite the lack of data or the lack of robust data, it seems that there were pirates all the way to the Comoros. Grandidier writes that as of the 13th century, Arab, Persian and Indian privateers crisscrossed the seas in this region. In the 17th century, you see the arrival of Caribbean or European pirates. However, the filibusters are less entrenched there in the Comoros than in Madagascar. They're mainly ports of passages where the pirates just wait for the winds to turn with the monsoon or wait for the dry season to set off towards other lands. The Comoros are made up of 4 islands. You can see them on the map, Grand Comore, Moheli, Anjouan and Mayotte. And they are between East Africa and the bigger island of Madagascar. This is along certain sea routes. Pirates don't seem to have left a deep mark on geopolitics in the Comoros in the 17th century. However, some branches of the descendants of pirates with Malagasy women took part in 18th century raids that almost did away completely with the populations in Mayotte and Moheli. So I'm going to turn for my talk today, first of all, to the most fictionalized aspects of Charles Johnson's writings. I'm then going to recontextualize that and look at how these filibusters actually went through the Comoros Island. And then I'll look at the impact of the settlement of pirate descendants in the archipelago. So first of all, in terms of the most fictionalized aspect, according to Jean Martin, the first pirates arrived in the Comoros in 1685. There isn't any real material evidence of piracy there, but the first evidence that we had would be 1693. However, 1693 corresponds to the arrival of Misson and Caraccioli. So we don't know whether these really existed aside from the book by Charles Johnson. Jean Martin says that the novelist drew inspiration from a critique of his time, and therein lies a probable grain of truth to their existence. Misson is a Frenchman from Provence, Caraccioli a defrocked Dominican prince. They apparently arrived in Anjouan in 1693, where they proffered their services to the regent queen Halima I in Domini, which is there on the map. At the time, Anjouan and Moheli were at war. Misson would have helped to provide aid to the queen, Caraccioli, with the concourse of other pirates and Anjouanese warriors, would have apparently repelled a landing of Mohelians on the Anjouan island. So these escaped massacre and were later arrested at sea. Following these adventures, the two mates and their crew took wives in Anjouan, and the story says that some of their companions gave up navigation, gave up their pirate ways to settle down and live comfortably with their wives on the island. Misson and Caraccioli then went to settle on the Diego Suarez side, where they supposedly instated Libertalia. Now, Misson and Caraccioli probably never existed because Charles Johnson is a novelist and there's absolutely no other reference made to them apart from in this book. However, it does seem that this tale of what happens in the Comoros does refer to actual real wars and alliances. And so it's probable that in 1693, the queen, the Sultana of Anjouan, and they're called Fani in Anjouan, was indeed Halima, and that she reigned in Domoni. In Gevre's essay on the Comoros that was published in 1870, his informer, that would be one Mohammed Washi, explains that around 1670, Halima the Sultana reaches power. He doesn't specify where the royal household lies, but he does point to the house of her grandchild who chose to settle in Domoni. According to Vérin and Alibert, who look to the former chronicles of a Cadi from Anjouan called Saïd Ahmed Zaki, the apparent capital of Anjouan would be in Domoni and was established there in 1520. And another element points to this. Anjouan tried at the time to maintain Moheli under its authority. Various authors point to the fact that this was due to the alliances between the sultans on these islands, and the two chroniclers do seem to concur. According to the family tree that you can see here, Mohammed ben Haissa, around 1506, so he was a Shirazian Muslim from Persia who settled in Kilwa on the East African coast. Then he moved to Grand Comoro, where he married, according to one of the chroniclers, Saïd Ahmed Zaki, a woman from Anjouan, and then set up in Domoni. According to Gevre, it's his son, Hassani ben Mohammed, who married the wife of one of the chiefs of Anjouan, Msamudu, and he would be the first one to settle in Anjouan. So father or son were seen as the first sultans of the island, but they are the ones who managed to establish the authority of the sultanate over the three other islands. According to Gevre, one of the young sons of Mohammed ben Haissa set up in Moheli. For the commentators, the older son of Hassani ben Mohammed married the son of the chief Mzamburu, who was the most powerful chief at the time in Mayotte. That would have enabled him to establish his authority over the four islands. At his death, his son, Haïssa, who was born in Mayotte, succeeded the reign, and that led to the end of the authority that they had over Maheli and Grand Comoro. When Haïssa, his wife, died, when Haïssa died, it's his wife who became queen, that thereby re-establishing the Sultanate of Anjouan on Mayotte. The Sultan in Mayotte is therefore possibly a descendant of Haïssa born in Mayotte, namely Mangwana Amina. But from the 16th and 17th centuries, the descendants of the Anjouan sultans continue to lay claim to the other islands, notably Mayotte and Maheli. Now, this seems nominal rather than real, but according to Gevrey, prisons were set up on the island to try to tame the rebels. For Jean Martin, the authority of Anjouan on Maheli is probably true, but this is not the case for him in Mayotte. He adds that much later, in 1838, Captain Craigie writes that Sheikh Muddar reigns on Maheli, but in fact this would be more of a governorship than a royal family, since Sheikh, the name, apart from pointing, it just points to the noble character, aristocratic character of a person. From the 17th to the 19th century, the Maheli chiefs will continue to declare their autonomous status until the sultans turn to the Europeans for help to quash their claims. This is what Jean Ovington describes in his encounter with the Sultan of Anjouan. And I quote, "After we had finished our tale on the power and glory of England and on the value and valour of the king, he told us that he deeply wished to repress the incursions of the Sultan of the neighbour isle, Monil, which is Maheli, who came to his island and killed many of his subjects. He'd only lost a number, but this is because his people had no lance, had no spear, had no way to defend themselves. They knew none of our modern weapons. In the arsenal of the king, there are 2 old guns that are broken and a pistol which is almost as wide as a cannon." So Jean Ovington talks about the sultans, and it's possible that he wasn't aware that he was his equal. Charles Johnson describes a similar situation to the one brought to bear by Jean Ovington. However, Jean Ovington and Charles Johnson are linked in their writings because both refer to the fact that the help that Europeans brought to help the sultanates quash the rebellion. And then there's the question of the arms that's mentioned by Jean Ovington. It's important to understand why the Sultan turned to the Europeans. The arrival of trade ships, but also filibusters, was really beneficial for these populations. After these dynastic quarrels, Anjouan would have made the most of its privileged position to replenish European vessels to enable itself to garner more economic and political clout. Indeed, in Grand Comoro there was not much drinking water because it's a volcanic island. It's still in activity, actually. Mayotte is surrounded by coral reefs, so it's difficult to access, and Moeli had twice massacred some of the seafarers that had landed there. So the fact that there were pirates there probably contributed through provision of weapons, but also economically in helping the Anjouanese to retain their hierarchical position in the 18th and 17th century. The other pirates that Charles Johnson talks about, aside from Misson and Caracoli, are pirates where we find evidence of their real existence in other texts. It's not always easy to define where they were or where they carried out their adventures and to what extent these were fictionalized. This is the case of William Kidd, who, according to Charles Johnson, became a pirate there. He stopped in Anjouan to repair his ship, and when he left, he started pillaging and plundering. He came to a tragic end. He came home to England, where he was promised amnesty if he stopped his plunder. The widow of an officer pointed to him as the assassin of her husband, and he was in fact hanged. Nathaniel North, I think, is less well known, but is more interesting in terms of trying to understand the interactions between pirates and inhabitants in the Comores. He was born in Bermuda. He was filibuster in the Indian Ocean, and he only attacks Muslim vessels. So between 1701 1702, he assails the capital of Grand Comoro, Iconi, which you can see on the map. And he's happier when he attacks Tingoni, which is the capital of Mayotte at the time, because there he can take as hostage the Sultan and exchange him for a huge ransom. Jean Martin then supposes that the Maoris heard about North because they were taken hostage and their liberation was also subjected to ransom. From 1702 to 1703, the three pirates, White, Booth and Bowen, abandoned their dying captain to go to Mayotte, where they waited out the 6 months of monsoon before heading out once again to Madagascar. 1 year later, in 1704, David Williams and John Pro may have arrived in Anjouan, prisoners of one of the warships, of Littleton's warships. He was a commodore who was in charge of chasing down filibusters. Captain Richard, who was the captain of, or one of the captains on the Littleton, may have decided to help the Anjouanese to repress the rebellion by the Mahilians. Captain Richards did this for a sum of money. Now, this story reminds us of the story of Misson and Caraccioli, but also Jean Ovington. During this during the combats between the seafarers, the two pirates, William and Pro, flee to Maheli, then move on to Anjouan, then Mayotte, and lastly Madagascar. Now, in these incipient years of the 18th centuries, the pirates move from one to the other according to opportunity, according to imprisonment, according to the replenishments and struggles they undergo. John Plantain settled more definitively in Madagascar after fleeing in 1720. At this time, Olivier Levasseur, the famous Labuse, apparently lost his ship on the reefs of Mayotte, and I asked divers over there. The shipwreck is not located if it did go down. But if it did go down, if it exists, we don't know where it is. He apparently rejoined the England pirate ship, which attacked two boats from the East India Company, the Cassandra and the Greenwich, as well as a battleship from the Netherlands. The Greenwich and the Dutch vessel managed to flee, but the Cassandra was plundered. This marks the end of piracy in the region. In 1720, the Royal Navy will go and see John Plantain to ask him where the other pirates are. In 1721, two vessels go through Mutsamudu to try and chase down filibusters. In 1722, Commander Matthews seeks out the boat Cassandra, but many corsairs had already taken refuge in Brazil or Guinea. According to Jean Martin, and I quote, the pirates had nothing more to expect from local chiefs. They were now involved fully in the European maritime trade. So they had very little transactions probably with the island inhabitants, but they had already contributed to increasing the métissage in the population. Now it seems very unlikely that there be descendants from a pirate community from Libertalia. There were, however, pirate raids in Diego Suarez and on Sainte Marie. And in the 18th century, the children born of Malagasy and pirate couplings, the Zana Malata, children of mixed race, who actually set up a new group called the Betsimisaraka, and they were seen as the descendants of pirates. Indeed, pirates are adventurers who seek to plunder and loot ships and coasts. But as of the 18th century, hundreds of canoes hit the islands and the Comoros, terrorizing the populations, plundering the villages and capturing the villagers. Jean Martin goes back over what Julien's says about the emergence of these raids, according to according to him, the Zana Mulata would have helped Anjouan and the sultans to impose themselves on the sultans of Domoni. They were then taken back to Madagascar once they'd helped the sultans of Mutsamudu, and they were taken back to Madagascar. One of these Zana Malata may have identified one of the Comores Islands and led raids there to try to find indentured workforce, because they're starting to lack workforce in the Malagasy lands. At the 18th century, there is more and more sugar plantations, and so they need more labor. Gevrey says, towards the month of October, the different village chiefs of the western coast of the east coast of Madagascar sent out armed canoes with 30 and 36 men each. They sailed up the coast towards Voemar. During the trip, other villagers join them in their canoes, and they move over to the Comores. Captain Tomlinson in 1809 adds, "They come at the end of the southwest monsoon. They build their huts around their walled villages in the island, and they just block everything off until the end of the northeast monsoon and then head back to Madagascar." But the starting point is Tamatave, where are the people who were grouped together by Betsimisaraka. In this group, you've got the Zana Malata, and they had specific commanding roles and were also asked to make a pledge to Betsimisaraka. And so they, in a sense, created a foreign nobility, a permanent settled foreign nobility. To conclude, the interactions of Miso and Caracoli go back over the main elements that show the interactions between pirates and local populations. The sultans could ask help from the Europeans who came to replenish their ships in their wars to try and submit the other islands. So in that context, the plundering of villages in the north, the plundering of villages by north is similar to the types of raids that were organized by the Malagasy. Even if the Malagasy didn't wait for the European filibusters or the Caribbeans to try to plunder and move from one island to the other, there were raids that were taking place in the Comores. These were raids that were instated by the Betsimisaraka and some of the descendants of pirates, and it seems to be an ironic echo to the history of piracy itself. Thank you very much.
Bonjour tout le monde.
Good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk to you about the legacy of pirates in the first decades after they were eradicated from Madagascar. So this really follows on from the other interventions we've heard. I'm going to talk about two main things. First of all, the political legacy of pirates with the creation of the Betsimisaraka kingdom by Betsimisaraka in the 1730s. I'm also going to talk about the economic legacy, again in the 1730s, which is when the slave trade really took off in the region on the northeast coast of Madagascar and in the Mascarene Islands. Now, just a few words about the context. You've already heard a few things about that today, but I'd like to say a little bit more. So this is the northeast region of Madagascar, from the Bay of Ontongil, the Bay of St. Mary, and the slave trading ports, Long Point, also known as Full Point, and Tamatam. This is for the geographical context. As for the chronological context, just to talk about what happened before the pirates arrived. This region of Madagascar was first visited by the Dutch at the end of the 16th century, in 1596. We have the first documented purchase of a slave in 1606, who was traded for 2 copper bracelets by Dutch traders. Then nothing more for a few decades. The VOC, the Dutch company, started slave trading journeys to Madagascar between 1640 and 1660, especially for their possessions in Mauritius, Batavia, and the Cape. But those expeditions were fairly irregular because they were not so successful because this region is quite far from the major maritime networks, major maritime routes of the era. So the Dutch decided not to go to this region anymore. They went to other regions instead, and so the northeast region remained fairly isolated, which is why from the 1680s pirates decided to settle in the island of St. Mary, which became an important safe harbour for pirates. At the same time, or in the following decades, 1690s, Adam Baldridge decided to settle there and developed the trade network with New York, so between New York and the northeast of Madagascar. So the slaves were bought from Madagascan rulers and then they were sold in the English colonies. This period lasted for about 50 years until 1625, 1730. St. Mary remained a safe harbour for pirates. The pirates then interacted with the local populations. As you can see in this example on the screen, they were dependent on a mixed-race person who'd married with the daughter of a king in the Bay of Antongil. And so this was a place where they could rest and find refreshment between their cruises. In the 1720s, it became increasingly difficult for pirates to carry on with their activity because of what the English did to prevent pirate cruises. So they had to put an end to their activity. They had 3 exit routes. They could decide to stay in Madagascar and to be assimilated with the local Madagascan population. Another possibility opened up by Louis XIV was to seek a pardon and to go to the island of La Réunion to live peacefully. They could also be captured, as was the case for Olivier Labuse, and end up being hung. Now let's talk about the Malata. The Malata are the children from mixed marriages between European pirates and Madagascan princesses. Madagascans had a lot of respect for the children born of those marriages. They had a lot of authority, and the Madagascans liked to use them as leaders when they went to war. Many of those Malatas remained on the coast, and they had names such as Baldridge, who's one of the children of Adam Baldridge. They had names such as Larry and Tom. And Tom played a very important role in the creation of the Betsimisaraka kingdom. Now let's talk about the rise to power of Tom Ratsimilawa. Tom Ratsimilawa was born around 1688. He's the son of a pirate. The first time that he's mentioned as the mulatto chief Tom of St. Mary was in 1729. During the following decade, he extended his power, and he played a key role by taking the head of an alliance of Malata chiefs to prevent Sakalava incursions, raids of the Sakalava kingdom, which is the most powerful Madagascan kingdom on the northwest coast. So they managed to stop those raids, and then Ratimilao settled on land in Madagascar, in Fulpoint most notably, which became a slave trading port in the 18th century. Then in the 1740, there was a consolidation of Ratsimilao's territory, as well as his power, as well as an expansion of the slave trade with the French. Ratimilao died at the beginning of 1750. As for Ratsimilao's succession, this is what happened exactly. Betia, his daughter, succeeded him, but then there was a civil war, so Betia decided to cede power to her half-brother Zanahari and to retire to the Isle of France, Ile-de-France. Before ceding power to her half-brother, she gave the island of Mauritius to the French East India Company, in exchange for which the French granted her peaceful retirement in the Ile-de-France. During the period that followed the death of Ratimilao, there was a period of strong French interference. The French played an active role in the political life on the northeast coast of Madagascar. First of all, they settled on the island of St. Mary, and then for the longer term in Fulpoint with their trading post. Now, it's important to note that the French were still supporting the descendants of Ratimilao, and we'll see why. Ratimilao's descendants were much appreciated by other Madagascans, and they controlled the slave trading ports, including Fulpoint. And so the French wanted to protect their interests there. The French, in the French Mascarene Islands, such as the Bourbon Island and Ile-de-France, which nowadays is known as Mauritius, had plantations, coffee, and this required a lot of workforce. So they sought out this workforce in Madagascar, loading their ships with firearms, money, Indian fabric, and alcohol. And so they went to the northeast coast and other parts of Madagascar and traded their cargo for slaves, but also for cattle and rice, because they needed to refresh their ships and to feed their growing slave population in the Mascarene Islands. This trade grew increasingly, and this had sizable consequences for the political life on the northeast coast of Madagascar. Now, after the death of Ratimilao, his son Zanahari took over. And the Zanamalata took on, because they are the sons of the Malata. So Ratimilao is a Malata, a mulatto, a mixed race. And so the Zanamalatas are their descendants. Under the reign of Ratimilao, the Zanamalata were at the height of their power. Their political power declined gradually thereafter. Under Zanahari, there was a civil war which brought the country to its knees, to the despair of the French, who had a lot of trouble to find provisions and refreshments, especially rice and cattle, due to this violence. After Zanahari, who died a violent death, Yavi took power. And from then on, French political meddling increased. The French supported the descendants of Ratzimilao in order to control the influx of slaves and rice to the coast and to ensure regular trade to the Mascarene Islands. At the end of the 18th century, at the beginning of the 19th, there was a steady decline in the power of the Betsimisaraka Zakavola, who was the great-grandson of Ratzimilao, only had nominal power. People respected the blood of Ratzimilao, but he had no authority. He was held in contempt, and the chiefs became more and more independent through wars. So the power of the Betsimisaraka chief declined, and the territory he controlled shrank over time. And this grew worse under Sassy's reign at the beginning of the 19th century, when the commercial agent Sylvain Roux arrived and decided to install a more powerful chief on the throne, which put an end to the reign of the Zana Malata. Then the Tamatav were conquered by the Creole Jean René in 1800. Why are the Zana Malata so important? What is the legacy of pirates in there? The pirates installed the slave trade. The Zana Malata are brokers in the slave trade, which started under the pirates. They control the slave trading ports with a regular influx of firearms that are used to assert their power, but also for raids, slaving raids. Their authority also relies on the fact that Betsimisaraka are considered as the heirs in the great family of the Malata. So local chiefs are attached to their persons, and they're also very proud of the fact that they have European blood running through their veins as descendants of Ratzimilao, who was the son of a European pirate and of a Madagascan princess. Now you can see that the port of Fulpoint became the hub of maritime trade on the northeast coast. Now you can see on the table the number of annual expeditions under each ruler. And you can see that gradually the slave trade increased quite spectacularly. Under Ratzimilao, there were on average 4.4 yearly expeditions. Under Sassy, this number had increased tenfold, with on average 40 expeditions a year. The slave trade really took off and became a way for Betsimisaraka rulers and the Zana Malata to assert their political, military and economic power. And you can see that over time the number of expeditions grew considerably. Up to 200,000 Madagascan slaves were traded between 1778 and 1810. You can see that there's a close connection between the presence of pirates and the beginnings of the slave trade on the northeast coast. Betsimisaraka, through their Zana Malata rulers, dominated the coast thanks to three main factors. First of all, they enjoyed French support. Until 1807, the French always preferred to support the direct descendants of Ratzimilao. So this is something that really helped them. Then they dominated from a political standpoint because they control the slave trading ports, including Full-Pointe and Tamatave, which ensured that they got a regular supply of firearms and other produce. As Zanamalata, they also enjoyed notoriety with other chiefs as the descendants of Ratimilao. And Ratimilao was very fondly remembered amongst the Madagascan population. And this is something that you can see in various anecdotes about the fact that the memory of Ratimilao is still very much cherished, which is why the Zanamalata could remain in power on the northeast coast of Madagascar for so long. I finished my presentation. If you have any question, don't hesitate to ask during the debate. Thank you for your attention.
All pirate utopias take as starting point the difficulty for empires to apply imperial order and law at their margins. In the modern period, the expansion of European states into the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were ways through which they became political empires, instating a world order. These empires had to face, nonetheless, the existence, tell us pirate historians, of interruptions, of vague borders, or zones of lawlessness at their confines, with which these empires had to accommodate themselves and deal with difficulties there. These zones are seen by pirate historians as spawning the first pirate utopias, breakaway mariners banding together and creating new political forms, thus enabling a proper counterculture, more democratic and egalitarian than colonial societies. This presentation aims to question the historical account through examining a legal doctrine of European law in the early modern period, one which allegedly led to the first pirate communities in the Atlantic world in the 16th century, the Amity Lines. Regularly mentioned by historians of piracy, this legal category supposedly points to an initial framework of international relations in the modern era, forged out of disputes over the Treaty of Tordesillas. At the end of the 15th century, the Spanish monarchy, trying to defend its discovery, had claimed sovereignty over all the West Indies kingdoms. These Spanish aspirations to American hegemony opened up a series of legal battles between the Spanish kings and their European rivals, notably the King of France. This lasted all through the 16th century. These quarrels supposedly led to the instatement of a new status quo, a new doctrine whilst waiting for the legal battle to be settled, the rival kings of France and Spain would purportedly traced two lines in the Atlantic. Usually we see this as between the Tropic of Cancer and the meridian of the Azores, declaring that beyond these lines, south and west, any encounters could be settled with the use of force, would lead to no legal claims, and would no longer disturb the peace in Europe. Thus defying the doctrine of amity lines, purportedly led to a whole lawless zone outside the peace treaty applications signed in Europe, thereby promoting the emergence in American seas of lawless zones where violence was unregulated. This thus in turn enabling French, English and Dutch seafarers to engage in a form of war at the margins of the Spanish Empire. Now, despite the attractive aspects of this tale, it's important in this presentation to open it to criticism by re-examining the diplomatic origins of this legal doctrine. French historiography regularly states that the origin of amity lines is attributed to Franco-Habsburg treaties. Historians don't agree, but they quote the Cateau-Cambrésis 1559 treaty or the 20-20 peace treaty in 1598. However, there is no documentary evidence that's actually brought to bear to establish this interpretation. Reading the correspondence by French and Spanish negotiators, which I did when you look at these two treaties, cannot enable us to establish that this kind of agreement was discussed during the period by ambassadors. The only source that historians could focus on to be able to tie in the origins of amity lines with the Cateau-Cambrésis Treaty is two letters by Queen Regent Mary of Medicis to James I of England, written in 1610 and 1611, 50 years after the fact. So this really, to my mind, considerably weakens the possibility that such a treaty actually was signed. Because of this lack of evidence and a lack of new evidence, it's necessary at this stage to conclude that there was no diplomatic agreement on the issue of amity lines in the 16th century. How then to deal with amity lines? Because amity lines are regularly mentioned during the 16th and 17th century by those who focus on expanding a marine presence, in French marine presence, whether it's the courts of justice, the mariners themselves, the colonial or maritime governors, or the royal power. This is what I'd like to do today, putting forward an alternative genesis to these amity lines, and I focus here on the methodological basis put forward by Lauren Benton in an article from 2005 called Legal Spaces of Empire, Piracy and the Origins of Ocean Regionalism. So what I wish to do here is threefold. Firstly, the idea is to reinstate seaborne predation within the scope of legal conflicts over access, control, and exploitation of Atlantic waters in the 16th century. Here in the Ancien Régime, this pitted against each other various authorities and powers that all lay claim to these waters and the seafarers within them. I intend to show furthermore that the category amity lines stems not from a diplomatic agreement, but rather from French mariners' understanding of geopolitics in the Atlantic in the 16th century. These mariners move in oceans of law, and I take up Lauren Benton's expression here. They had to use law to defend the legitimacy of all their actions in American waters. And lastly, I'll show how the French monarchy, as of the 17th century, then used this legal category to be able to defend its claims over Atlantic waters. Attested to as of 1504, French ships explored coastlines throughout the 16th century. They go to Brazil, the Guianas, they go to the islands of the Caribbean seas, despite the Iberian prescription to do so. There are crews from Normandy, from the Basque Country, or from La Rochelle, and towards the end of the second half of the century, only from Normandy and La Rochelle. They carried out a whole spate of activities. They collected wood dyes, they go to the Caribbean to trade with the Amerindian communities there, or with the Spanish settlers and colonizers, They also take part in seaborne predation. The economic aspects of these fleets was already heavily studied by historians. They show that the French presence in these waters occurred early, as did the presence of these carriers for the development of French port. In France, these fleets are placed in, that are not at all in a legal void. Rather, they're ruled by a whole series of judicial and legal procedures. Firstly is the leave to arm for war. A naval captain has to ask for this leave to arm for war to be able to leave one of the ports in the kingdom. He pays a tax to do so. This is necessary to legalize his activities in the waters, notably should he run into foreign vessels. The second procedure is the way that gains are adjudicated. Once back in port, the ship's captain has to show his prize, prove legal obtention in front of the competent authorities before once again paying a tax. That's the payment of the 1/10 of the value in the Admiralty. In the French Admiralty, prizes are adjudicated by officers in specific admiral courts of the first instance. The appeal can then be lodged in a special tribunal that was called the Marble Court. And marble courts were headquartered in Paris or in Rouen as of 1508. Outside the remit of the jurisdiction of the French Admiralty, the provincial admiralties of Brittany, Guiana, or Provence had their own courts, and appeals were lodged before these courts and the rulers of the provinces. The Royal Council could also deal with issues of prize if a foreign ambassador asked him to do so. And so there were special councils to adjudicate and temporarily settle disputes that arose. Lastly, these ships didn't only spark interest within the communities of merchants in the Atlantic or the Channel. No, the princely and aristocratic societies also invested in these expeditions. They were encouraged to do so by the fragmentary nature of maritime authority of the crown in the 16th century and by the legal pluralism at play in France in the Ancien Régime. The French Admiralty embodied the authority of the crown on the sea, but it only had jurisdiction over Picardy and Normandy. In the rest of the kingdom, the admiralties of Brittany, Guiana, and Provence escaped the royal authority and nonetheless brought to bear much revenue for cargo owners. Port and maritime province governors were also ship owners and rivaled the authority of the French Admiralty within its own jurisdiction. They had the right to also give leave to make war. The fragmentary nature of the maritime powers in France therefore enabled a huge spate of powerful individuals to increase their personal powers. They shipped boats, they shipped fleets to America, authorized seaborne predation, and sometimes developed their own foreign policy in an autonomous manner from the crown. Now, this legal context and the wars between Spain and France at the time explain how easy it was for French seafarers to carry out seaborne predation against Iberian forces in American waters. Until 1559, there was practically uninterrupted war between the European powers, France, Italy, and Spain. This enabled the mariners to privateer in America and justified their prize. In 1559, the Cateau-Cambrésis Treaty opened up a new period between the Valois and the Habsburgs. Between 1559 and 1595, the two crowns were at peace. The end of the conflict didn't sign the end, however, of the predatory practices by French seafarers on Iberian fleets in America. The number of corsairs exploded as of the 1560s. This huge rise was linked to the civil conflicts that shook France during the Wars of Religions. Michael Augeron, historian, has shown how the Protestant race in the American seas played a strategic role for the Protestant princes. It enabled funding sources to be opened to fund the Protestant struggle and open a new front for war against Catholicism in America. From La Rochelle, Henri de Navarre and his mother Jeanne d'Albret would distribute leaves to privateer. Whatever their religion, the mariners could therefore instrumentalize the fragmentary nature of the maritime powers and the civil wars rife in France to continue their predation in America. This golden age of French corsairs ended in the late 1580s. This period was marked by a huge reduction of French ships sent to the Americas. Historians argue that this was due to political or economic factors. For example, the lack of funding for shipbuilders after the religious wars, or the union of the Spanish and Portugal crown. And you can also think about the fact that at that time, Philip II of Spain bolsters all his fleet and colonial ports in the Caribbean. There can also be internal political factors to the Kingdom of France. For the seafarers, it was more and more difficult to justify their privateering operations in the maritime provinces of the kingdom. There were many tensions, political and social, that had appeared between these authorities or the provinces, between the elites, the merchant elites in the cities, and the seafarers going to America. In La Rochelle, after the Sixth War of Religion, a conflict broke out between the Protestant princes and the merchants in the town. The latter had condemned the princely policy of giving leave to sail as corsairs, which was seen as going against the economic interests of the merchants in the town. They didn't want to be perceived as a pirate city by the outside. In Normandy, at the same time, there is a high rise in the number of trials for piracy against mariners coming back from America. And these are started by the parliament in Rouen, which steps into the jurisdiction remit of the Admiralty Special Courts. At this time, the Rouennais merchants had started to turn away from direct trade with America. They'd started to focus exclusively on the Spanish Americas through Sevilla. And so they were worried and concerned about what the Norman mariners were doing in America. Their privateering could have important consequences on their trade relations with Peninsular Spain. This is all the more true because Rouen was also home to a huge community of Iberian merchants. The magistrates in Rouen were multiplying the trials in piracy to try to defend the interests of these shipbuilders. And these argued that they had to be held responsible for plunder and pillage undertaken by crew when at sea. It's in this context that you see a real change in the discourse around prizes taken. In the trials, the defense of seafarers took the form of petitions, appeals that were addressed as of the 1580s to magistrates in the sovereign courts or directly to the Royal Council. In these petitions, the authors would depict an Atlantic world rife with violence, where war is endemic, where the subjects of the King of France are victims at the hands of Iberian tyrants who have no respect for treaty law. Placing these violence in a timeless chronology, the authors invoke for the first time imaginary lines that divide the Atlantic, lines beyond which the Iberians chase them down and stop them from trading, going against the freedom to trade of mariners. These petitions were written to the Royal Council. They called for the sovereign's protection. They asked that the king protect trade and navigation for his subjects in the Atlantic against the Iberians. The authors also defended strong economic activity and seaborne predation. What they were effectively asking was that the king legitimate privateering and the fact that they could give chase to the Iberians in the Atlantic in a time of peace, giving a sort of a right of remonstrance in a spatialized form. They also wanted the royal powers to act against the Rouennese magistrates who continued to receive the complaints of the Iberian merchants during time of peace. At the turn of the 16th and 17th centuries, these petitions called on royal powers to confer legitimacy to their actions committed at sea beyond one of their lines. Now, this means that we should look at the way in which the monarchy apprehended privateering in the 16th century and the response that was provided by the Crown to these demands and claims made by the mariners after the Vervins peace treaty. Firstly, during the 16th century, the monarchy had never authorized a policy of plunder in Americas. The religious wars had effectively promoted privateering, but this was because there was a weakening of the maritime authority of the Crown. Following the Third War of Religion in 1570, a weakened royal power was forced to guarantee the amnesty or forgiveness to Protestant prince for depredations committed on foreign Catholic vessels. Between 1570 and 1572, the Crown had asked for return of prizes taken on Spanish vessels. And this was all linked to a demand made by the King of Spain. Now, this never happened. This period between 1962 and 72 set aside, the attitude of the Crown vis-à-vis maritime or seaborne predation followed the same relations as the princes. During peace times, the Spanish ambassador would ask the Royal Council, who would regularly convict seafarers found guilty of piracy. However, in the wake of the Vervins Peace Treaty, in the context of renewed interest by the French Crown to trade and navigation, the Crown was concerned with reinstating maritime authority, specifically weakened by the wars of religion. Now, this authority was embodied at the time by the French admiral Charles de Montmorency d'Anville, 1595-1612, and then by his nephew, Henri de Montmorency. And he was admiral from 1612 to 1626. Under their admiralties, these two princes, with the support of the Crown, regained authority in their jurisdiction. Now, this went through the re-establishing Admiralty's control over the subjects of the King of France. So there was a royal decree from the Royal Council, 10th of March 1607, where the Crown reaffirms the Admiralty's monopoly on giving leave to go to war. It also bans the Parliament from conducting trials for piracy. Charles de Montmorency set up the first permanent prize council, which was there to judge appeals in his name and therefore went against what the Parliament in Rouen was doing. The Admiral finally reinstated tax collection for the Admiralty, notably taxes on issues of leave and on prizes. These were very important sources of revenue for the Admiralty. The French Admiralty would then wanted to be seen as the unique authority to distribute leave to arm for war and adjudicate prizes. So this concentration of the Admiralty's powers within the kingdom also led to the defense of seafaring activities in the Atlantic. For the first time, the French Admiralty issued a right in its leave for mariners to go beyond the lines of amity, and I quote, and to give chase to those who disturbed French fleets in American waters. Going back over the arguments made by mariners in their petitions, these leaves evoked an Atlantic world beyond the lines, where lawlessness and violent and endemic violence was carried out against French mariners and justified the intervention of the French Crown. In this context, the lines of amity mentioned in the letters of leave weren't a declaration of war to Spain. They were rather an authority to make war to all those pirates and lawless peoples who infect the seas beyond the lines and plunder merchant fleets. And so in this context, they were an extension of the claims to legal powers and jurisdictional power over a maritime area that was seen apparently outside the remit of French fleets, and so outside the purview of the law. This is a region where the French Crown wanted to defend and impose its law, wanted to give the right to French subjects to navigate and trade freely. So for the first time at the beginning of the 17th century, the French monarchy, through its admiralty, tried to stake a claim to sovereignty over the Caribbean seas. In fact, almost 25 years before the first colony settlements in the French islands of the Americas under Cardinal Richelieu. Let's conclude. Through this presentation today on amity lines and their legal framework in the French monarchy, I wanted to show how the French monarchy effectively spatialized imperial law or lawlessness to be able to lay claim to wider territories in the Atlantic. The legal foundation of these amity lines can be re-examined in light of the legal rivalry between seafarers and merchants, between the crown and competing maritime authorities within France. And it shows the way in which you could control space through law. It also allowed the emergence of a pirate counterculture, zones of lawlessness, and the margins of empire. They used the repertoire of chaos and generalized violence in the waters to push through their new ambitions. Far from living a life on the margins, the mariners that I talked about and the seafarers in this survey knew full well how to instrumentalize imperial law. They did so by pitting one against the other to defend their interests. In the Atlantic, those seafarers who engaged in seaborne predation were the vectors of, or gave rise to, a liquid form of sovereignty that would flow along the oceanic and coastal routes by imposing the jurisdiction and the law of the King of France right into the American waters. Thanks for your attention.
On va laisser tout de suite directement la parole à Rediker.
We're going to let Mr. Rediker speak straight away. We'll just wait for the technicians to give us the signal.
Marcus, the floor is yours.
Marcus, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Vincent. It's a great pleasure to be back at quai Branly. It's a great pleasure to work with the two of you again, and I do want to thank you for your labor in making this event possible. It's a great pleasure to be here with these young scholars, even though they do make me feel like an old timer. And if they make me feel that way, it's because I am. I first published an article on piracy 40 years ago, almost exactly 40 years ago. I've been working in this area for a long time. I thought it might be useful to offer here at the beginning of my remarks a few comments about the evolution of the state of scholarship on piracy and seafaring. So let me begin there. Now, when I first started working on these subjects in the 1970s, it was a lonely undertaking. At that time, sailors were not even considered part of labor history for the most part. Piracy had attracted a lot of attention, always, mostly by amateur historians, but very few trained scholars. But then all of this began to change, and I would highlight two great forces that made things change. First, I would emphasize the importance of the social movements of the 1960s and 1970s in the United States, and I do think around the world in many instances. The struggle over civil rights, Black Power, the war in Vietnam, and women's rights. All of these movements demanded new kinds of history. And that kind of history did begin to develop. So the rise of social history is a major development. And within that, something that is called history from below, history of ordinary working people. This approach challenged the old white elite history from above. And this transformed, I think, the way we began to be interested in seafaring and piracy. Now, the second change, almost a paradigmatic change, happened about a decade plus, 15, 20 years later, essentially as a side effect of the globalization of capitalism in certain respects. And here I'm talking about the rise of Atlantic history, transnational history, and then even more recently, global history. And within this turn, the global turn as it's called, maritime history acquired a new significance. Seafaring people, it was slowly discovered in one field of scholarship after another, have been central to all kinds of history in our water-connected world. Historical subjects, like sailors, who appeared to be marginal to land-based national histories suddenly became important to a broader approach, because these are the people who connected the world that is now our object of understanding. So I call these two developments taken together, the rise of history from below and the rise of transnational history, as the revenge of the so-called marginal people. Now, today, we have more and better scholarship on seafaring people and on piracy in particular than we have ever had before. These have become very important areas of scholarly inquiry, and I am very happy to say that the research presented at this symposium exemplifies the point, especially in the deployment of a consistently transnational perspective. Crossing borders, looking beyond the nation state, very important. Piracy now is seen as central to a wide variety of very serious historical subjects, as we've seen in the previous presentations, the history of trade, of smuggling, of empire building, of the rise of capitalism. Piracy is now important to state formation, to the development of legal systems, both national and international. Piracy is important to popular culture, and I could go on and on and on, but this is to say that piracy is a very hot topic right now, and it has been for several years. Really important that a subject attracts high quality researchers, and a lot of them, because that's how we make progress. The more people we have working on these kinds of subjects, the better off we will be in the long term. Now, here is a related point relevant to our sponsor of this event. It is, in my view, very important that museums like Quai Branly become places of research and discussion for these kinds of topics. Now, that's because maritime ethnography, and I do believe that's an important phrase, maritime ethnography, is an area of study of enormous significance. Treating a ship, for example, as a social and cultural system. And I would emphasize that my friends in the Italy-based group called Hermeneutica are proving this point, doing very creative work, combining it with activism. Vincent or Anna, maybe someone can drop a link into the chat so that people can learn more about Hermeneutica. Okay, so maritime history, in my view, is now central to any serious engagement with connected world history. I'm using that in contrast to comparative world history, which is a little different and not necessarily maritime, although in many instances it should be. And yet this fundamental truth is very slow to dawn on a large number of historians who still work within the narrow confines of the nation state. This is, by the way, not to suggest that the nation state isn't an important modality of power. Clearly it is one of the greatest, but it is never sufficient as a frame of analysis. Now, some years ago, partly as a joke, but partly serious, I kept trying to come up with a way to describe this blindness of the sea among historians, the fact that so many people considered the seas to be ahistorical voids, somehow not even real places on the earth, abstractions, places where history didn't happen. History happened, most people believed, and I think many still believe, on land in nation states. So the word that I came up with to describe this bias, it really is a bias in our modern thought, is terracentrism. We have terracentric narratives which leave seafaring people and maritime enterprise out. Now, there are obviously some fields that don't do that. The history of exploration is one, naval history is another, but most other fields still don't take the maritime on board. This, folks, blocks our collective imagination. It also limits our understanding of what happened and how things happened. Very important processes happened at sea. Class formation, race formation, nation formation, all these things happened at sea. And institutions like Quai Branly can help to change that. That would mean also changing the way you see your own mission as a museum. But I think that's very important. So I also want to say that I have observed today's symposium with what I would call a bit of detached amusement. Detached because I don't work on piracy anymore. It's been quite a number of years, but amused because here we are, 300 years later, still debating the history of pirates and debating the story of Libertalia in particular. What tremendous staying power these historical subjects and their ideas have. And why they've had that staying power is an issue that I'd like to return to at the end of my remarks. But suffice it to say for now that this very meeting embodies big intellectual transformations over the last 35 to 40 years, playing out across the world, and how we have learned to think about the past in new ways. So I'd just like to call attention to so much that is new in this symposium. I think that's very important. Okay, so let me say a few words now about Libertalia. It turns out I wrote an essay about this many years ago, 1991, I think it was. And so I reread that in preparation for this meeting after having read David Graeber's book, Pirate Enlightenment. Now, David and I think all of the members of this symposium agree on one very important point, which is that Libertalia itself was a fiction. Vincent mentioned this at the very opening of our symposium. It's a literary invention. That is not controversial. A second point I think is rather more controversial and something that David Graeber and I agree on, which is that real, empirically proven historical social practices by pirates both inspired and shaped that depiction of Libertalia. In other words, there is a causal effect of what people did in reality upon the creation of that myth or that fiction. So to that extent, the ideas that were embodied in Libertalia were real living conceptions. They were definitely not utopian. Utopian means they don't exist anywhere. They existed. They existed on ships, among real people, in real material circumstances, all around the Atlantic. And I do think we need to keep this idea very much in mind. Did Daniel Defoe write the section on Libertalia in Charles Johnson's General History of the Pirates? There's still debate about this, again, as Vincent mentioned. My view, having studied thousands of documents about piracy, is that he did not write it. The book was probably the work of a team of writers. They're often called Grub Street writers in London, who had various kinds of knowledge, including some connections to actual pirates whom they interviewed. Defoe, by the way, was already famous by 1724, and moreover, so he wouldn't have really cooperated with Grub Street writers. But more importantly, he was writing 11 other books between 1722 and 1728. So the man was rather busy. One or more of the writers of the general history attended the trials of pirates in London and also had access to unpublished manuscript materials that were circulating in official circles. I've actually read some of these manuscripts, and there is almost word for word, sentence to sentence, in some instances, direct correlations with what appears in the general history. Now, the biggest argument against Defoe being the author of the section on Libertalia is that it contained much more detailed maritime knowledge and information than he possessed or even understood. Okay, so, but even if Defoe didn't write it, that does not make the section on Libertalia any less fictional. I suppose it only makes it less literary. Now, the historical meaning of Libertalia depends very much on how we look at it, from above or from below. Both perspectives are valuable. If we look at Libertalia from the point of view of empire builders, judges, merchants, royal officials, and writers seeking to entertain a largely middle-class reading public, then we get certain kinds of insights from that knowledge. But if we look at Libertalia from below, the history looks very different. Now, we also have to bear in mind that knowledge of the ideas in Libertalia did not circulate only through print culture. In fact, I would suspect, there's no way to prove it, but I would suspect it didn't circulate even primarily in print culture, but rather through oral culture, through the stories that were told and retold on ships, on docks, in taverns, in the streets. This is how the knowledge of piracy spread. And what's really fascinating about this is that some of the fundamental ideas of a general history of the pirates are clearly obvious before the book is published. I can go into detail about that if you like. Anyway, I'm glad that David Graeber's book is attracting so much attention in France. I look forward to future editions in other languages. And so let me say a few words about that book. David Graeber looks from below without apology. His book is an essay. Let's keep in mind it's an essay, which means literally an initial attempt at understanding. The work is far from definitive. If David were with us, and I wish he were, he would be the first to admit that. Yet the book has some really unusual strengths. First of all, it is based on great learning. Graeber knows a lot more about the Betsimisaraka than most of his critics. He is playful and he is provocative about what he knows. He is a graceful and clever writer. He is the kind of person that one would like to accompany on an adventure into the past. He weaves a rich tapestry of historical possibility about alternative ways of living. These, I think, are tremendous strengths of the book. I'll say more about other strengths in a moment. But I want to, just for now, mention that I think the book has some limitations. It is, of course, a synthesis of existing knowledge and is therefore limited by the current state of knowledge with all of its gaps and holes. The book is based on an extensive reading of published primary sources, but not based on archival sources. Much of the history that is treated by Graeber is not only unknown, but unknowable. And of course, he admits that too. He uses inference, speculation, and I think most importantly, he uses what I would call a logic of cultural process to understand the historical issues that he addresses. And I think that is a very important part of his method. Okay, now here's another point. I doubt whether there were as many pirates in Madagascar as Graeber and numerous other people claim that there were. Thousands seems to me to be completely impossible. I even have serious doubts about many hundreds. Of course, there's no way to be sure because the sources are lacking, but this point of how many is really crucial. And people who are doing this kind of work being done on the symposium might be able to advance this issue more precisely, because Graeber's argument about the impact of pirate culture on the cultures of Eastern Madagascar depends on the density of the physical presence of former pirates. In other words, the smaller that number, the less likely and the less long-lasting the influence will be. Now, as an aside, since we want to look at this subject broadly, I would also add that the pirates who settled in Madagascar were only a small percentage of the total pirate population between roughly 1660 and 1730, the Golden Age. And Atlantic pirates were much less involved in slave trading than were those who based themselves in the Indian Ocean. Okay, so as we think about Madagascar, here's another point to keep in mind, and I don't think anybody's addressed this point yet. It is important to remember that pirate culture, and by that I mean the ways of running a pirate ship, the institutions of running it, the organization of power. Pirate culture itself was a dynamic phenomenon that changed over time. There were, as I'm sure everybody here knows, 3 distinct generations of pirates in the Golden Age. There were some continuities in their cultures, but they were not identical by any means. So as the buccaneers of the 1660s and 1670s gave way to the pirates of the 1690s, many of whom went into the Indian Ocean, who in turn gave way to the pirates of the 17 teens and 1720s, pirate culture became more egalitarian and more democratic over time. That's because in that process of generational change, more and more elites dropped out of piracy, and common sailors gained more and more control of pirate ships. So it's really crucial to understand which group of pirates we're talking about and to see that pirate culture itself is not static. It's actually dynamic. It's also crucial that the pirates who did settle in Madagascar in the 1690s, however many of them there actually were, did so at a time when big merchants and slave traders still had a great deal of control over their actions. Okay, so let me return to Graeber's Pirate Enlightenment. Okay, here's my biggest point about it. I think this is one of the most creative books ever written on the history of piracy. The main reason is that Graeber has great powers of mind, his knowledge is deep, and most importantly, he has fresh ideas to offer. Now, most books on pirates have no new ideas, and many books on pirates have no ideas at all. They have simply research findings, which are useful but limited. Graeber brings something fundamentally new to the discussion, and he challenges us to think in new ways. And I think the tendency of people who have worked on piracy is to dig in and defend the old view, but I'm asking everybody to take very seriously what he's proposing. Now, what Graeber is saying that's new is that he looks at the process of change involving pirate culture from the point of view of the Betsimisaraka, and he looks from below, as I've said. He shows how the peoples of Eastern Madagascar were knowing, acting, conscious agents of history who made choices about cultural inclusion, made choices about transformation within the matrix of their own values and their own cultures. Okay, this is something new. Now, Graeber's knowledge of both the structure and the culture of these East African societies and how they changed over time is critical to this. And even where he lacks sources about specific people or events or times, I find him frequently to be very convincing, and for three reasons. First of all is that his field work has given him a great depth of knowledge. His working understanding of the Malagasy language is crucial. And finally, because he now, I guess it was probably for more than 20 years, he had very serious intellectual and cultural engagements with people in Madagascar. So what he's done, in my view, is something really unusual. He has combined two different kinds of history from below: maritime history from below and a kind of indigenous history from below, an indigenous African history from below. This is an unusual combination, and it is a winning combination in my view. Now, he treats ordinary people, especially women, as thinkers. Now, as there's a kind of intellectual history from below in all this, as creators, as makers of history. Graeber's methods and his theory are just as democratic and egalitarian as the culture he seeks to illuminate. Now, I'm sure everybody knows I am not a specialist on the history of Madagascar. And what I would say is that the influence of Graeber's book is probably going to depend to a very large degree on what scholars of the Betsimisaraka have to say about it. Graeber has offered an interpretation that seeks to make the best sense of all of the surviving evidence over a long span of time. Now, he may be wrong in some particulars. That remains to be seen, and I really can't judge all of the details, but my guess is that his larger interpretation is going to be difficult to refute. Okay, so let me turn now in conclusion. Oops, excuse me. Okay, so to conclude, David Graeber challenges us to think. This is precisely what essays are supposed to do, to advance and challenge our thinking. At the same time, some of his ideas are not as new as he claims, but on the other hand, some of his ideas are even bigger than he allows. So let me give an example of each. First of all, to say as he does that the egalitarianism and democracy of pirates are not Western ideals is not a new idea. 20 years ago, Peter Linebaugh and I wrote a book called The Many-Headed Hydra, in which we argued that these principles of social and political organization were created, preserved, and recreated by a multiracial Atlantic proletariat, the so-called motley crew from roughly 1600 to about 1835. Now, there was a tradition, we've argued in that book, of maritime radicalism. It had a very long life. I won't say, in using a landed metaphor, that it was an underground existence. Let's call it a below decks existence, which popped up at various moments in history to offer new political possibilities. Among pirates in the 17 teens and 1720s, in port city rebellions of the 1730s, in the American Revolution in the 1760s and 1770s, and in the massive Atlantic-wide mutinies of the 1790s. Now, Graeber does not go into the origins of pirate culture. He sees it as something more or less sui generis, but it is important to remember that its origins were maritime, international, and proletarian, the product of mobile peoples. But on the other hand, Graeber's argument about enlightenment is much bigger than he modestly claims. He's talking here about enlightenment from below, and this absolutely cries out for more study. To all the young people out there looking for subjects, enlightenment from below, I think, is an important one. It's, of course, much older than what pirates did in Madagascar in the 1690s. It goes back much, much further, in my view. This kind of enlightenment goes back to the early European contact with the social and cultural worlds of Africa and the Americas, to the late 15th and 16th centuries. And I here mention the work of a scholar named William Brandon, who had a very important set of points to make in a book that itself wasn't a great book. So it never got a lot of attention. But what Brandon has pointed out, and I think many of us know this, but the reporting about the classless and stateless societies that Europeans found in Africa and the Americas had a profound impact on European social thought. A profound impact. Libertalia is just one example of that kind of thing, and there's a lot of important research to be done on this. Let's remember, for example, Sir Thomas More, in whose book Utopia, 1516, it begins with a sailor named Raphael Hiflode, who has come home from the sea and will tell the story about a society that he encountered that lives without private property. A sailor's yarn. Let's remember Montaigne and his great humanist essay of Cannibals, 1580, about indigenous people in Brazil. Now, in that essay, you probably all know, Montaigne inverts the common received wisdom of the day and argues that it's the Europeans who are the cannibals, not the indigenous people. But what is not known is that he got the story from a servant of his who was a sailor on a voyage to Brazil in the 16th century. So again, a sailor's yarn circulates. And then finally, let's remember William Shakespeare. Went down to the docks, talked to sailors about the wreck of a vessel called the Sea Venture, which shaped his play, The Tempest, 1611, one of the first great literary works about New World slavery. So let's remember that sailors have been vectors of knowledge for 500 years and more. They have provoked, they have inspired, they have informed many of the greatest philosophers from above. And in the spirit of Carlo Ginzburg, we need to look at the circulation of ideas from above and below. And if the formation of the Betsimisaraka was a proto-enlightenment experiment, as David Graeber calls it, it was only one among hundreds. So let me conclude by referring back to the title of this gathering, The End of Libertalia, with a big question mark. I have an answer to the question posed. I salute all of the new scholarship that's being presented today. I think it will lead to new understandings. But at the same time, I do believe that Libertalia as an idea will never come to an end. Likewise, I think the romantic fascination with pirates will never come to an end. And here's why. In times of great inequality, injustice, and oppression, people will always love outlaws. Those people who defied the powerful of their day and tried to live in new ways outside the law. So the debate about Libertalia is not going to go away until rich men and cruel injustices have been abolished. I hope that happens someday, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. And then just one final irony that informs this entire meeting. Pirates lost the battle in their own day. They were hanged by the hundreds, as you all know, in conscious, deliberate acts of state terrorism. The point of hanging pirates and hanging up their bodies in chains was to terrorize sailors and prevent them from turning pirates. This is all very well known. Those bodies dangled at the entrance to practically every Atlantic port city. Crows picked at the flesh, the bodies degraded under the power of the elements. Pirates lost that battle. Many of them paid for the loss with their lives. They embraced a merry life and a short one. But here we are, still talking about them, still debating what they did, still trying to decide what is the meaning of it after 300 years. We do not necessarily remember the names of the rich men, the capitalists and the imperialists who hanged them. So in this sense, pirates lost the battle, but they won the war for cultural memory. And I do think there is some justice in that. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Marcus Rediker, pour cette.
Thank you very much, Marcus Rediker, for this really interesting, fascinating presentation. Thank you to all the participants. I think what I can do now is leave the floor, before any further ado, to the various panelists, so that we can start the ball rolling. And I just wanted to point to a few links that you made that kind of crisscross the various different presentations that we heard. And notably, you were talking about the multiple perspectives, the different top-down, bottom-up approaches that need to communicate, that were rolled out in very different ways. And we heard about it in different ways when Raphael was telling us, for example, about his vision, or the vision of pirates as merchants as well. From their perspective as tying in land and sea, in a sense. And then we heard, from Marcus about this maritime ethnography, and that was looking at what goes on in the vessels themselves, and therefore the difficulty of treating or dealing with the sources, all the types of different sources that we have. And again, what can be called rumors in an anthropological perspective. How do you deal with that in an anthropological sense? Rumors can be sources as well. And it's something that is part and parcel of what anthropologists see as cultural production, as culture production. Marcus called it pirate culture. So it's fascinating to see how, when you take this prism and we look through this particular lens, you get a very different sense of history, anthropology, and indeed museums, because pirates, real or imaginary, come from or a part of historical processes, of social history, of social movements, and of a transnational, transborder history. And I think, I'm sure we'll talk about it for those of us in the museum, in terms of how to instate a museum practice to be able to move away from this kind of land-centric approach that we have. So thank you once again. Thanks very much. And I'll give the floor to whoever wishes to take it so that we can have some response for Marcus. There are lots of questions actually on the chat, but I'm not sure. Does anyone want to take the floor from those panelists who are here? Otherwise, we'll start reading the questions as well, no problem.
vois pas de main se lever.
I can't see anyone raise their hand. David? David. Go for it. Well, it was a question actually more that was geared towards Raphael, but it came to my mind when I was listening to what he was telling us, and I'm just, again, talking as a complete non-specialist of Madagascar. I thought that your presentation was really striking, and it really highlighted the way in which we generally tend to think of these as Atlantic patterns, but they also had an impact in the Indian Ocean in the early modern period, because you can see that you have this literal coastline state, the Betsimisaraka, who also captured slaves that were also there to be sent to plantations. And this is a phenomenon that we tend to think about in the Western African countries, but you also see it in the Indian Ocean here. Now, one question that sprung to mind, I got the impression that you were trying to highlight a paradox in terms of the phenomena that you put forward. I get the impression that you're talking about a Malagasy royalty that was created, that was incipient in the 18th century, partly thanks to the French, and partly thanks to the slave trade, because it enabled that state to draw profits from the slave trade to quash their enemies. And then at the end of the 18th century, you seem to talk about internal political factors, whereas at the same moment, that is the culminating point of the slave trade. So what this raises in my mind is that I'm just thinking, are the exogenous factors, were they really that important? When you say that the French took part in played a role in creating the Betsimisaraka or the slave trade, were exogenous factors really that important? Just wondering.
Allô? Oui. Ah, ok, c'est mieux. Oui, merci David. En fait, oui, la situation
Thank you, David.
complexe en fait sur cette côte.
It's a very complex situation. I'm trying to understand myself what's happening, what's really happening. The sources aren't always necessarily that clear, but what's happening is that you have the first firearms arriving. The Betsimisaraka were the first to obtain firearms so they could use them against other groups that didn't have them. Then the situation stabilized when the slave trade really began, and when other communities were able to obtain firearms, not in as large quantities as the Betsimisaraka, but still there was a rebalancing of the situation. Now, the fact that the Betsimisaraka rulers were looking for more slaves destabilized the territory around them, which was going to rebel against them. So the situation really didn't play in favor of the French, because it destabilized their policy in favor of the Betsimisaraka, which is what happens after a period of succession where a civil war occurs and the neighbors are going to rule in favor of one or the other, side with one or the other. The reason why they were able to rule for over a century is because the French supported the Betsimisaraka descendant who would otherwise have fallen from grace a long time since. So I hope that's clarified a fairly complex situation just in a few sentences. The slave trade is an element, but it can really complexify things with regards to the Betsimisaraka. I'd really like to thank Marcus Rediker. I'd like to thank you for your summary and for your intervention. It's really very interesting. I really like the way you deal with David Graeber's work, trying to look beyond the sources. I'm a historian, I work intensely with sources, and they're not always easy to find when it comes to pirates. We try to understand what's really happening with anthropology. I'm not a specialist of the Betsimisaraka per se, but I'm not 100% sure that the situation today really does reflect what may have happened in the past. I might look at this with too much of a historian's perspective. I think that the slave trade did have an important impact, and that the Betsimisaraka benefited from the presence of the pirates. So, as you said, so I'd really like to thank you for your intervention. Now, Raphael, about the issue of numbers of pirates raised by Marcus. In the chat, there's a recurring question about the presence of 135 pirates on the island of St. Mary. According to sources that are not in Madagascar, but in the departmental archives of the Morbihan district. It's a bit like in Tintin, the treasure's not on the island, it's in the archives. So on the issue of pirate numbers, which raises the issue of the perception of the pirate as a pirate or as a trader. Branly does tend to favour quantitative history. We have finir, avec, who's a historian who looks into this issue. So I'd like to know whether you think that's an entry point with regards to which there can be advances. On my thesis on the slave trade, the pirates only occupy 6 pages out of 600, so I haven't exactly found a lot of information on this era. But from 1678, when the slave trade from Bourbon Island started, you can see that there are exchanges between the pirates there and the colonial authorities of Bourbon Island. Who tried to reduce the number of pirates, whether through force or persuasion, persuading them to surrender and settle on Bourbon Island. So there's quite a lot of information about that, but about the number of pirates, it's always fairly tricky. If you come up with numbers in memoirs about this period, you have to be very cautious because it doesn't necessarily reflect reality. However, what we know is that it could be as many as several hundred pirates at any one given time. Sometimes pirate ships capture other ships from the VOC, for example, but how many remained at the end of the pirate in the 1720s? That's hard to know, and what's even harder to know is to know where they left for. What became of those pirates? In the district archives of La Réunion, there was quite a lot of documents on this period, but about the number, the presence of that many pirates, it is quite hard to find sources. It's quite different from the slave trade when it comes to quantitative history. For the slave trade, there's a lot more reliability to do with the number of sources. I tend to work a lot with sources. I think that these sources are very scattered. From the 13 colonies to... Because we tend to talk a lot about pirates in Madagascar, but far less about the pirates in Comoros, as Mathilde has done, in the Cape and other parts of the Indian Ocean. And I think that a lot remains to be learned. And if we could gather all of that information and extend our field of study to a wider geographical field, that would be really useful.
Je vois qu'il y a des Des commentaires de Maurizio?
Are there any comments from Maurizio, perhaps? Matteo, you can moderate. Alexander. Just to add to what Raphael was saying and to answer Jean-Soula's question, Marcus Rediker and Raphael are correct in reminding us that it's difficult to assess the number of pirates, and in thinking that maybe there weren't as many as we tend to think. Archives are quite hard to deal with on this point because sometimes archives are memoirs written to promote Madagascar, and so they tend to increase the number of pirates present on the island. Now, about the island of Sainte Marie, there are several waves of piracy in Madagascar, and they tend to be very short. Now, about the 1720s, we can observe that that's the end of the pirates of Madagascar when Commodore Matthews stopped there in 1722. There was hardly anyone there. There was a few fleeing pirates. There's no fort. There's no defense, no cannons, no fortification. He describes some traditional, let's say, traditional dwellings next to a Madagascan village and a very reduced presence of pirates. Now, 2 years later, when Labuse and other pirates that I mentioned earlier in my presentation wrote from St. Mary to the governor of the Bourbon Island, it's clear that they're in a desperate situation, stuck in St. Marie, and they're asking for a pardon, for an amnesty from the governor, so that they can come with their slaves. But it's important to note that on the period as a whole, as Marcus Rediker was saying, there are perhaps 100 cases. It's quite hard to assess, of course, but what's important to recall is that their objective was not to stay there, but to acquire wealth and to go back to Europe or to the American colonies. But of course, the issue of numbers is very important, and it's very hard to assess. It's quite frustrating because either you have archives that are completely fictional. In 1712, there was a project to capture Madagascar based on the idea there are 400 pirates living in Sainte Marie in Madagascar. 20 years later, in 1730, the Czar of Russia had a vague project to colonize Madagascar. And he says that there are 1,500 pirates in Madagascar, so it's hard to distinguish fiction from reality. I think Fanny wouldn't say anything different about the statistical sources that she's working with. Governors inflate numbers for quite understandable reasons to validate their action. That tends to be the case with any source. Maurizio would like to say a few words. First of all, I'd like to thank Marcus Rediker for the wonderful conclusion, which I share wholeheartedly. That was also what I was trying to show in my presentation. I was trying to talk about the contribution of this book beyond the fact that it's not complete in terms of sources, etc., but it's this way of looking at history from below, which is also why I quoted Bertolt Brecht and Chris Harman, who are also proponents of this history as per Gramsci. Now, about the issue we're debating now, about the cultural transmission that may have occurred between the pirates and the Madagascan population who founded the Betsimisaraka Confederation. I don't think that transmission can be conceived only through sheer quantity. I think there are also cultural events, cultural predispositions which may allow transmission or less so. Accordingly, if you think of the impact that Captain Cook has had on the Fiji Isles, as mentioned by Salins, you can see that it's not just a matter of quantity. There are also qualitative issues, cultural issues, which are really tough to analyze, much more so than lack of sources. It's more to do with a lack of understanding, lack of knowledge of those cultural factors and of those events which may mean that cultural transmission is successful or not. And one of the main issues, one of the main problems with Graeber's book is how this cultural transmission can be explained, this cultural transmission which may have occurred between pirates and the Madagascan population. This is a key anthropological problem. In other contexts, sometimes it's possible to find some basis in local legends or mythology to interpret the presence of foreigners amongst the indigenous population, but this is lacking with the Betsimisaraka population. We don't know what the Betsimisaraka thought when those pirates or merchants arrived. Did they really make a distinction between the pirates with their democratic approach in their ship management, between those pirates and the merchants with their completely capitalistic approach? So this is a question that I'm asking myself and that I'm asking you as well, if you have any ideas on the subject. Just to take the idea of transmission further than just the quantitative aspect.
Maurizio, thank you for the question. It's a very complex question, and it's not easily studied, as you've said, but I do have a comparative perspective that might help. And that is, in many parts of West Africa, there grew up during the course of the slave trade a mulatto elite who mediated the relationship between slave traders and people on the interior. So this is kind of I think anthropologists call this a broker culture. Now, I think that, see, it's also linked to the changing division of labor, right? So it's a structural question as well as a cultural question. So in my view, now I think Graeber has actually already done some good work to help answer the question you've posed. For example, he emphasizes the ways in which the cultures of northeastern Madagascar are very good at incorporating outsiders. This is actually true in many parts of West Africa, especially in regions where there have been wars and vanquished peoples and remnants who needed to be brought in. So this kind of incorporative cultural dynamic is certainly a part of it. And I don't think that this is true of a great many cultures, but the ones who have contact with seafaring peoples tend to be that way, tend to be more open to some kind of connection or collaboration. So I think that comparative perspective might help. The other thing, just to go back to something else that came up in the earlier discussion, it's absolutely true that we deal with rumors, with stories, with myths, with tall tales. I mean, sailors are famous for telling tall tales in which half of what they say is invented. But it's also important to know that those tales and those rumors and those stories can themselves be material forces. This, I think, was made very clear by the great French historian Georges Lefebvre about the role of rumor, especially among peasants in the French Revolution. This becomes an almost independent force in its own right. And this, of course, is part of the power of storytelling. So I think Graeber has probably done everything he can with myths and storytelling. He was surprised that there wasn't more about the pirates or about seafaring people. And the Betsimisaraka, I don't know that body of work in order to say, but I think that local storytelling might be a key to understanding how this happened. Now, I also agree with Raphael that as things change over time, one might predict that the people in northeastern Madagascar would become like other coastal kingdoms and attach themselves to slave traders. Right? This happens in lots of different places in West Africa. It becomes a source of advantage, of firearms, of power vis-a-vis your enemies. So this is a strategic choice of alliance that people make. And so we would expect, no matter what the pirate influence may have been at one time, for that to lessen throughout the 18th century. And I think the number of slave traders who actually show up and do business proves the point that things were changing in that direction. But yeah, these are really tough questions about methodology. But here's the last thing I would mention about this. When you're studying something for which there aren't a lot of sources and you're trying to study it from below, it's really important to understand what might have happened which you don't have documentary proof to explore. In other words, we know that these stories are a very important means of communication among sailors. Seafaring is a storytelling culture. I would recommend to everybody this wonderful essay by Walter Benjamin called The Storyteller, in which he goes into the morphology of stories, and the seafarer is one kind of storyteller, the peasant is another kind of storyteller. It's really a tremendously brilliant essay. But it's very important to know what are the means of communication at hand that are not registering in the documentation that comes down to us. In other words, the social world is more important than simply the documentary traces of it. And then you use that knowledge, as Graeber has done, to speculate, to infer, and to imagine what the connections might have been.
Raphaël, il voulait rebondir sur ça?
Raphaël, you wanted to bounce back on this one?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if Maurizio wanted to react to what Marcus said. Non, c'est bon. Non, oui, effectivement, merci Marcus pour
Thanks Marcus for your words. This is always the difficult thing, and you have to underline this question of the sources and how you can work with sources to try to get a sense of what the reality on the ground was at the time. It is quite a complex exercise, but I just wanted to come back to one issue which you pointed to, these brokers, this broker culture in terms of the slave trade, because in a sense that's what I was trying to point to in my presentation. There was a before the arrival of pirates and an after piracy, and they really were responsible for instating the slave trade. It wasn't there before, so they did have a major influence on the slave trade, on local politics, on the Zana Malata, we know about that. So the Malata and the Zana Malata took this position as intermediaries, as brokers, as those that were able to make the link, to cross bridges between the European culture on the one hand and the Malagasy culture on the other. And that's what you see in the Sakharov Kingdom as well, in the northwest. It was mainly the linguistic barrier that was then resolved through these descendants who started off speaking English and then learned French, because it's the French that are traveling through the island and it's the French that are dealing with the slave trade. And they realize that all the Betsimisaraka that live on the coast can grapple with French to be able to open up discussions with these merchants. And so that is something that I haven't really underlined, this broker role, this intermediary role between the two cultures. That is of the essence, absolutely. But it's not unique to pirates. There are also the deserters, the French deserters, soldiers who come and settle there, or Africans, Malagasy rulers who send their children to learn French on Réunion and Bourbon, and then come back and gain more prestige and have more power at home. And again, that issue of being able to compare with East and West Africa, what's going on in Madagascar, it's quite useful, especially when you're looking at the slave trade. And I think the different phases as well that we're looking at here, because the sort of pirate phase is really of the essence, and it comes to a close at a point when the Mascarene slave trade really kicks off. And that gives Betsimisaraka the opportunity to instate himself as the ruler, with all this cultural baggage that he wields as well as a descendant of pirates, with all that legacy. So he can really draw profit from that slave trade, that incipient slave trade there. Just to close then, we were talking about this earlier, if the Malagasys, whether or not they make the difference between different Europeans and merchants from shipping companies or pirates and so on, I think that they can see the difference. But I'm not sure. I think they actually see the pirates as merchants, in a sense, because they see them as coming from the outside, as foreigners who bring a source of wealth, a source of power, people that they can sell slaves to at a high price. And so in a sense, they deal with them perhaps in the same way as they would with merchants. I'm not sure you can have a completely different approach to pirates taking a Dutch vessel off the coast of the Sakharov Kingdom, or whether they were able to, or say a pirate ship attacking a vessel from the East Indian Company, or whether it's a war between Europeans. Is it pirates? Is it just merchants? For them, they're all merchants in a sense. They're all the source of merchandise, and that's just what I wanted to add on that in that regard. Yeah, just Mathilde. Mathilde, you've asked for the floor as well. Yes, it's a good thing I speak just after Raphaël, because we were talking about decentering the gaze, and so I was thinking about what was just being said about the slave trade. I'm not a historian and I'm an anthropologist, and so of course I don't have this in-depth approach to the sources that you might have, Raphaël, but I was thinking that it was very interesting in terms of the Comoros, where the slave trade is perceived as a raid, and you were just seeing it as a sort of transaction between of goods in a sense. And so I thought it was really interesting to think about how, as soon as you move to another geographical location, or as soon as you change your approach, you really put the emphasis on something else. So that's just to contrast the two presentations and the two islands. And then another thing that I was wondering in relation to what Marcus Rediker was saying, you were talking about how in Madagascar, in the northwest, they they integrate, the pirates settled with the help of women, of course, that women played an important role in that integration. But what I found striking was that these pirates who supposedly married Anjouanese women in the Comoros, for example. Again, I'm not a historian. I haven't done my field work in Anjouan, so I'm not necessarily aware of what the case is. But I'm not sure that there are descendants in Anjouan like there are in Betsimisaraka groups. And I thought it was really interesting to try to compare this in an anthropological perspective, because in the northeast of Madagascar, I would assume that it's a patrilocal group, whereas in Anjouan and in all the Comoros Islands, it's essentially you live with the mother or with your wife. And I get the sense that the Malagasy women have even more of a stake in ensuring that they can garner male economic resources, and therefore to have a role to settle, perhaps with pirates, but perhaps with other European seafarers, and therefore have a descendancy. Whereas in the Comoros, where there is a more matrilineal aspect to things, there's less of a need perhaps for them to do so. But there's also Islam there, so the women are much more hidden. In the archives, you get a lot of archival evidence where women are very much hidden away. So it's perhaps more difficult as well for them to build alliances. But I just thought it was interesting in terms of comparing two places that are geographically very close and where the pirates went, and so we're able to encounter incredibly different populations with very different cultural organizations and kinship systems as well. Thank you. Marcus, do you want to step in?
Yeah, Matilda, thank you for that observation. I think that really would be an ideal comparison to try to see exactly how this presence of pirates played out in two related but distinct cultural systems. And to try to ask the question, why does it seem to have had a greater impact in one area than in another? And there are economic reasons for that, both economic reasons from below, which have to do, as David Graeber stressed, with women who work in markets and want to use, I love the phrase, he calls the pirates clueless outsiders, that women basically realize that they can use these men to their own ends. And I think that's important. But in both places, in Madagascar and in the islands, we've got to remember, Raphael, these are also, these pirates and sailors are seen as military experts. These people know how to fight. And this is a very important thing that they bring to the table, their knowledge of European firearms, their ability to train local armies, you know, so again, we have to think back to what kinds of knowledge, useful knowledge, these sailors and pirates actually bring. For example, there are various places where, in Africa, for example, a man who deserts a pirate ship who was a gunner, an expert in the use of artillery, would be a tremendously valuable man on the coast of West Africa. And so these people know, they have some idea of what their skills are worth in different places. And so I guess we come back to this idea of endless negotiation, right? Negotiation, I think, is a really good word for what happens in these kinds of alliances, which sometimes are brief, sometimes have more lasting power, but there are deals being made. And I would love to see how the deals vary from one place to another based on what the needs are, based on what the cultures are, and based on what both sides in the negotiation are trying to get out of it.
Merci. Juste pour tout ça, en prenant un exemple de...
If I could just take one example in terms of what Mathilde was saying, and just to look at the Indian Ocean context, which I know a bit more about. There's also a lot of work on the role of women within a historical perspective, and this is linked to all of the stereotypes that were bandied about the role of women in Polynesian cultures. And sorry, it's not the Indian Ocean, it's Oceania. The interpreter corrects herself. In terms of the imaginings, the fantasies, and the tropes that Europeans exchanged, and that made me think about the kinds of comparisons that we could make, and breaking outside the borders, if you like. And there's a question from Alexandre as well. And just before giving the floor to people in the chat, I'll give the floor to Alexandre for his question. Yep, I'll be very brief to ensure that Maurizio and others can take the floor. And you may have understood earlier, when we were talking about Libertalia, I defended or propounded the idea that Libertalia was a fiction, despite the fact that it was in a realistic context. But this is a question for Marcus Rediker, in a sense. It's something that I'm quite intrigued about. Maybe like everyone here, we'd all dream to be able to delve into the mariner imagination. And in 1716, Alexander Spotswood, who's governor of Virginia, received a letter that indicated that Thomas Béraud wished to recreate a second Madagascar in the Bahamas. A second Madagascar is actually the term that's used in the letter. And I'm really intrigued by that, because I've often wondered, especially when I was writing this book, what could Madagascar be in terms of, the fantasies around it, in terms of everything that we've talked about. So I really thought about what it was for them at the time. How did they perceive it? You who are very cognizant of the archives, have you found other mentions made of Madagascar during these years, outside the archives that are dealing specifically with Madagascar, I mean? Is Madagascar mentioned elsewhere? In the Bahamas, in the Caribbean, in other American colonies? Is that something that crops up elsewhere? Because I just find it really interesting and really intriguing, this idea of a second Madagascar kind of cut and paste into the Bahamas. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Alexander. And by the way, I hope your book finds an English publisher. You're asking me to turn through research notes in my head that go back a long way. I can tell you that there are references to Madagascar as a place that stands out, you might say, in the imagination of ruling groups. And that and I think it's, as I recall, now, I would be hard pressed to come up with specifics, but it's got a sort of a dual character, I think, when it comes up as a symbol. On the one hand, it's got the lawless pirate association, but on the other hand, it's also got a certain Edenic or utopian quality, that it is a place of beauty, a place of development. Okay, so I'm not sure exactly what the person petitioning Spotswood had in mind in 1716, but that certainly is a very interesting moment to be suggesting something. But I think this kind of thing, there are certain things that make impressions on ruling classes, and I've been very interested in a point that's related to yours. In other words, which are the struggles of the past that ruling groups refer to when they try to understand something new that's happening in their midst? And in the English-speaking Atlantic, one of the most common references in the midst of some sort of disorder or uprising, someone will say, they're levelers. They actually go back to the English Revolution. They're levelers, so there's a kind of ruling class demonology of different sorts of figures they'll use. But I think what you pose is a really interesting question. We need social histories of ruling groups. We need to know what their fantasies are, what their kinds of knowledge are, what how they see the world. I've always wondered what is the actual map of the world in the head of an 18th century sailor? Like, what parts of it do they see? Can they imagine? What parts of it are blank? It's mostly port cities. It's not going to be the interior of any place. It's going to be places around the coasts where they've been. What's the map in the head of an imperial official like Spotswood? I think these are questions that we can pose historically to the sources that we read and maybe advance our understanding.
Merci.
Thanks. Maybe we just have time for a last question from Maurizio. And then I'll leave the floor to Vincent to close.
Mauricio, could I say one thing?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you for including the poem by Brecht, because in truth, that poem is the perfect anthem of History from Below. That if I want somebody to understand what History from Below is, I say read this poem by Brecht. So thank you for that.
Et justement, comme je le disais, c'est
l'épigraphe. And quite as I was saying, it's the epigraphy of from the popular history of humanity by Chris Hammond, another history from below. So the two are completely intertied, that's clear. But in terms of this sort of micro history or looking at history bottom up, and I don't want to close the discussion with a negative qualifier, but when we're thinking about transmission, we often think about what is transmitted, what this involves in the exchanges that we have. But more rarely do we mention the things that we don't understand, the misunderstandings, the bits that elide us. The fact that people in an exchange hear or take what they want. So there's a kind of universalism of ethnocentrism, or in the encounter between two populations that are distinct. Each will have their own interpretation of the other. So in the case of Madagascar, for example, the idea that the métissage, or the fact that there was mixed races, is enough to really bring together and glue a culture, synthesize different cultural approaches. That's problematic, because in terms of the pirates, as described by Graeber, the Malagasy women stayed in situ, and they were the ones that had very specific ideas about the foreigners that they married or had relations with. And this is true again in the world today. It still happens in Madagascar. And perhaps it's to do with this completely ethnocentric idea where you think, who is this French pirate? Who is the pirate? Perhaps the legacy of pirates to their mixed race children was, in a sense, that ethnocentric bias. So perhaps the Zanamulata children weren't this kind of perfect mathematical 50-50 synthesis between the two cultures, half this, half that. And so you can't say that just because they're born of two people from different cultures, that doesn't mean that's why they adopted all these practices. Cultural history is often born of misunderstandings, actually. I can't remember how to say it in French, but... So that's just, I'm just throwing that in there. The idea of misunderstanding as well, or misinterpretation, that's also, in a sense, something that should be valorized. It's positive in research, and it's also part and parcel of human interactions per se.
So I think as an object of inquiry, it's just as interesting as those happy kind of synthesis. I think we're getting to the end of our time slot. I'd like to thank all of the participants for these debates, especially Marcus. This has reminded me of those chess tournaments where the master is playing several games in parallel. I'd like to conclude by saying that we were lucky enough to talk about this topic because there's something exceptional happening with young researchers at the Quai Branly Museum. There are a lot of researchers here on the Indian Ocean. Unfortunately, the health crisis has meant that many people have stayed longer than expected, such as Maurizio, who's been with us for more than 2 years. And so we've ended up with quite a surprising situation with many researchers working on a space that doesn't exist in the museum. And I'll sing my usual song about the terracentrism of museums, because museums are organized by continent. We have an African unit, an Asian unit, Oceania, Americas. There is no such thing as the sea or the ocean in our organization. And we all know that what tends to leave the deepest imprint on us are these categories that are there every day and that tend not to be questioned. It's very normal at the Musée du Quai Branly to say I'm an African specialist, but it's much more unusual to say I'm a maritime specialist. The sea does not exist as a cultural space. So I always very much appreciate Marcus's comments, who obstinately and quite rightly wants to put the sea at the heart of some of our thinking. It's very relevant, and I think that the small research group that we have with David on the Caribbean and others who've succeeded him or more focused on the Indian Ocean shows that we should reflect on the way museums are organized in such a way that the sea is marginalized, whereas I wholly subscribe to the idea that there is a lot going on in the ocean which is very difficult to understand from a historical standpoint, but also in the modern world. Off screen, I could talk to Alexandre about how we get to know a stopover before going there. I was lucky enough to sail in the Indian Ocean about 30 years ago aboard a ship that was meant to hunt pirates rather than host pirates. I was lucky enough to get to know Djibouti before getting there. I'd heard so much about the place on the ship. There's a saying, which is that what happens in the sea stays in the sea. I think there is such a thing as a seafaring culture. Seafarers like to exchange objects, and those who brought back our objects are, after all, seafarers. They've played a huge role in the collections that we house. I'd like to thank Marcus for putting the sea at the center of the village, as we say. I'd also like to thank Mathilde, because she brought something very important to the table. We talked about Madagascar a lot, but it's important to have put Mayotte in the picture. I don't want to attribute points, but we've all understood that the more diversity we have, the Indian Ocean is not represented at the museum, and Mayotte is even smaller within this space. So it's very important to cross-reference things and to see that, to show that from one island to another, circumstances were different, and that Libertalia maybe has more to do with the Comoros than with just Madagascar. That was also one of the lessons that we drew from the discussion today. So I'd like to thank all of you for having shared this culture. I'd like to let David Graeber talk. We're all deeply regretful of the fact that he could not be here today. There's one voice missing in the conversation. So we'll have to convey his voice through the reading of his book. We hope that there will be a translation of his book. We will also have to read Alexandre's book. It would be great if both could be translated into English. We've shown that dialogue between specialists of modern history and anthropologists, as well as specialists of Madagascar and other islands. This is really the hallmark of the way in which our group works. This dialogue between disciplines has really given very good results. So I'd like to invite the crew to stay on the bridge. La ciurma, as they say in Italian, remains mobilized, and surely we'll have other opportunities to talk about pirates or about the sea. There are many proposals, and surely if another book is published, if other archives are uncovered, surely there will be another opportunity to have pirates in our program. So I'd like to thank those who've followed us today, as well as others who will follow us later, because a lot of people are asking whether this broadcast will be available as a replay. This is the advantage of the life we're living at the moment. Our discussions are more accessible on the YouTube channel of Quai Branly Museum. I'd like to thank the organizers who made today possible, and I'll say see you tomorrow when the museum opens again, which we're all delighted about. Thank you very much.